The voice belonged to Reed Morrison, one of the younger wildlife officers from the Billings outpost. Reed didn't rattle easily, but Harold could hear it now. Fatigue, worry, and something close to guilt. Harold didn't ask for details. "Bring them here," he said simply. "I'll be waiting." When the call ended, the silence returned thick and heavy. Harold swung his legs out of bed joints, stiff from age and cold. The cabin floor was freezing under his bare feet. He reached for the old flannel coat hanging by the stove, its seams worn and patched, and began to move. Years of habit guided him like muscle memory. The emergency protocols, the supplies, the preparation for fragile new lives in distress. Outside, the wind screamed down the valley, shaking the pine trees that bordered the Silver Ridge Wildlife Reserve. Harold worked quickly, lighting the old kerosene lamps, stacking wood in the stove, until it roared and dragging out the insulated crates from the storage room. By the time the kettle began to whistle, he had transformed his cabin into a small haven of light amid the storm. He hadn't done this in years, not since Margaret. The thought came uninvited, sharp as broken glass. Margaret had been his partner in every rescue, every bottle-fed night. Together, they'd built a sanctuary for the forgotten, the wounded eagles, the fox kits, the mountain lion cubs orphaned by hunters. But when cancer came, even Harold's calloused hands couldn't build a fence strong enough to keep it out. The cabin had gone quiet after she passed the cages empty, the routines abandoned. He told himself the silence suited him, that he was too old, too tired. But as he checked the thermometer and adjusted the heat lamps, he realized how easily those old rhythms returned. When the headlights appeared through the snow cutting across the white void, Harold stepped outside the cold, biting his skin through his gloves. The vehicle crawled to a stop, doors creaking open. Reed and another officer climbed out, their faces pale under the beam of the cabin light. Between them, they carried a crate covered with a tarp. They were found in a storage facility outside Helena. Reed said, his voice trembling, "Illegal transport. The mother didn't make it." Harold nodded once wordless and motioned them inside. The heat hit like a wave as they entered, the smell of pine and coffee, replacing the metallic scent of snow. Reed set the crate gently on the floor, then knelt to lift the tarp. Inside were three small, motionless bodies. Fur-matted eyes, half-closed ribs visible beneath their spotted coats. One of them, a male larger than the others, was breathing fast, shallow gasps that made his sides twitch. Another smaller one lay perfectly still, except for a faint flutter beneath the fur that told Harold it wasn't gone yet. "How long?" Harold asked quietly. "2 days without food. Maybe longer without warmth," Reed said. "We tried formula. They wouldn't take it." Harold knelt beside the crate. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, one gloved hand resting it near the edge, close enough for them to smell him. The largest cub lifted its head, weakly, nostrils flaring. For a second, just one, it met Harold's eyes. There was nothing human in that look, and yet something inside him broke open. "They'll make it," Harold said finally. "They have to." Reed hesitated. "You sure you're up for this, sir? The roads'll be shut for days. You'll be on your own." Harold gave a faint, tired smile. "Son, I've been on my own a long time. But not tonight." As the men drove away, the storm closed in again, erasing their tracks. Harold carried the crate to the enclosure and placed it near the stove. He watched the cubs for a long time, listening to the wind claw at the cabin walls. Somewhere deep inside the storm, something stirred, a faint pulse of purpose, of warmth returning to a life long left cold. By dawn, the storm had quieted into a soft, suffocating silence, the kind that seemed to swallow even thought. The world outside Harold Green's cabin was a sheet of white drifts piled against the windows, the trees bent low under the weight of ice. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wood stove, expanding with heat in the faint, uneven breathing of three fragile lives. Harold had moved the bobcat cubs from the crate to a low wooden pen lined with wool blankets. He had adjusted the heat lamps again and again through the night, never satisfied, his body moving on instinct while his mind wandered to darker places. He'd sat beside that pen for hours, whispering nonsense words, the same soft tone he used decades ago with injured fawns or orphaned owlets, words that meant nothing but carried warmth. Still, the cubs didn't stir. The largest one, the male Reed had called Rocky, lay stretched out, his chest heaving in shallow, erratic rhythm. His eyes, sealed tight, bore faint scars from trauma, temporary blindness, the officers had said. Harold wasn't so sure. The other two, a timid, golden-eyed cub and a tiny female half their size, huddled beside him as though clinging to life itself. They hadn't touched the meat or the milk he'd offered. Not a single sound had come from them since they arrived. Harold leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching them through the steam of his coffee. It was strange, he thought, how grief always looked the same, whether in a human heart or the small, trembling body of a wild creature. You could see it in the stillness, in the way the world dimmed behind their eyes. He rubbed his face, the bristles of his beard scratching against his palms. "Come on, little ones," he murmured. "You've made it this far." But the silence pressed back harder, thick and unyielding. He went about the morning task as if routine could tether him to something solid. Boiling water for formula, cleaning the small cages in the adjacent room, checking the reserve's power generator. He could feel Margaret's absence in every corner, her handwriting still faded on the feeding charts, her old wool scarf hanging by the door where she'd left it the night before the hospital took her away. She would have known what to do, how to coax them into drinking, how to reach across the gulf between terror and trust. He paused beside the pen and looked down at the cubs again. Their fur was beginning to fluff from the warmth, their tiny paws twitching occasionally, but their eyes remained shut to him, to everything. By afternoon, Harold's exhaustion began to show. He'd been awake for nearly 36 hours. The snow outside had deepened a white wall against the window panes. He sat back in his chair and felt the loneliness close in again, the familiar echo that filled every winter since Margaret's passing. He'd told himself that peace was found in solitude, that he was content with the quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was retreat, the kind that made a man stop feeling altogether. He dozed off at some point, only to wake with a start at a sound so faint it could have been a dream, the creak of the floorboards behind him. He turned and saw Ginger. The cream-colored cat stood at the edge of the room, her green eyes fixed on the pen. She was small, graceful, and silent, her fur catching the lamplight like pale gold. Harold had almost forgotten she was there. She'd been with him since Margaret's last winter, more a ghost of comfort than a companion. Ginger patted closer, tail low, gaze steady. The cubs didn't react. Harold frowned, unsure whether to shoo her away or let her be. Domestic cats and wild ones were not meant to share space. But something in Ginger's posture, alert yet unthreatening, made him wait. She sat down, curling her tail around her paws, and began to purr. The sound was low and constant, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. She didn't move toward the cubs, didn't meow or make any sudden gesture. She just watched them, her purr thrumming like a steady heartbeat in the silence. Harold sat perfectly still, feeling the strange calm that settled over the room. For the first time since the cubs' arrival, the air didn't feel so heavy. Minutes passed, 10, maybe 20, before Ginger stood up, stretched and padded away without a sound. Harold exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He didn't know what to make of it. That night, as he was cleaning the empty bottles, he saw Ginger return. This time she carried something small and faded in her mouth, a stuffed toy mouse frayed from years of use. She walked to the pen, crouched low, and carefully pushed it through the bars. The toy landed inches from the cub's paws. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the golden-eyed cub stirred. He blinked once, nostrils flaring, sniffing at the strange offering. Slowly he crept forward, one hesitant step at a time. Harold didn't move. The cub touched the toy with his nose, then looked toward Ginger, who sat utterly still. Finally he lowered his head and rested it on the little mouse, closing his eyes. Harold felt something swell in his chest, a fragile, wordless hope. It wasn't food or heat that had reached them. It was recognition. A bridge between loss and life, carried in the quiet compassion of a cat who knew what it was to grieve. As the night deepened and the wind rose again, Harold sat in his chair and watched the sleeping cubs. The smallest one, the frail female, had shifted closer to the toy. And for the first time since the storm began, he thought he saw her chest rise a little stronger, her breathing steadier. The cabin was still silent, but it wasn't empty anymore. Something unseen was stirring within those walls, a flicker of warmth in the coldest season of his life. By the next morning, Harold woke to an unfamiliar sound, soft movement inside the enclosure. When his weary eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw it. The golden-eyed cub, the one who had claimed Ginger's toy, was sitting up. His small ears twitched as he batted gently at the stuffed mouse. It wasn't much, just a weak, clumsy attempt at play, but it was life. It was will. Harold set his mug down, his breath catching. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. For the first time in days, hope didn't feel foolish. He let the moment play out, not daring to interfere. When Ginger padded quietly into the room, she moved like she belonged there. The air seemed to shift with her presence. She stopped beside Harold's chair, looked up at him as if seeking permission, then slipped through the slightly open enclosure door before he could decide otherwise. He froze. Every instinct told him to stop her, but his hands didn't move. He just watched. The bobcat cubs stiffened at first. The smallest one, the frail female, pressed herself tighter into the corner. The golden-eyed one, Scout, stood between her and the strange cattail, twitching defensively. Rocky, still blind, turned his head toward the sound muscles tense beneath his spotted coat. And then Ginger did something that made Harold's throat tighten. She lay down. Right there in the middle of the straw, she stretched out on her side, small and still. No hissing, no challenge, no attempt to assert dominance. She began to purr, a deep, steady rhythm that filled the enclosure like the hum of a lullaby. It was a sound Harold knew well, one that had kept him sane through sleepless nights after Margaret died. Minutes passed. The cubs stayed frozen. Ginger didn't move. Then slowly the smallest cub, Poppy as Harold had started to call her, lifted her head. Her eyes, dull and clouded, flickered toward the sound. And with trembling steps, she crawled forward. She reached Ginger's side and pressed her tiny body against the cat's fur. Harold's vision blurred. He covered his mouth, afraid to make a sound. Poppy stayed there, her frail chest rising and falling against Ginger's warmth. The purr never stopped. And for the first time, Harold felt the suffocating silence of the cabin break not with noise, but with presence. From that day, something changed. Ginger returned to the enclosure daily, as if on a mission. She would groom the cubs, licking their fur with careful precision, cleaning their faces when they slept, nudging them gently toward food. At first, only Poppy followed her lead. But by the end of the week, all three were eating again. Rocky's damaged eyes began to open little by little, his pupils adjusting to the light. Scout followed Ginger around the pen, watching her movements, mimicking the way she sniffed the ground or pawed at objects. And Poppy, once too weak to stand, started to play. Harold could hardly believe it. He'd spent decades rehabilitating animals, but nothing like this. It wasn't the heat lamps or formula that had saved them. It was something older, something instinctual, a kind of cross-species grace. He began taking notes, recording observations the way he used to when he worked in research. But the more he tried to quantify it, the less sense it made. This wasn't biology, it was empathy. One evening, as snow fell in a steady hush outside, Harold watched through the glass as Ginger lay curled around all three cubs, their small bodies rising and falling against hers. It was a tableau of peace, something that looked ancient and holy. He thought of Margaret again, not with the stabbing pain of grief, but with the quiet warmth of memory. The next morning he heard laughter for the first time in years. His own. It burst out when he saw the cubs copying Ginger's every move, rolling in the straw, when she did pawing at her tail, even lying belly up in a patch of sunlight the way she loved to. He couldn't stop smiling. "You're turning wildcats into house cats, girl," he chuckled. Ginger flicked an ear but didn't look back. She was too busy corralling her mismatched litter. But not everyone at Silver Ridge saw it that way. A few days later, Derek, one of the reserve's new assistants, approached Harold with unease. "Sir," he began carefully, "I don't think this setup is appropriate. You're domesticating them. They need to learn wild behavior if they're going to survive." Harold leaned on his cane eyes, tired but sharp. "They need to remember what safety feels like before they can remember how to hunt," he said softly. "You can't teach survival to something that's given up on living." Derek hesitated, then nodded, unsure how to argue with that. In the weeks that followed, Harold and Ginger became quiet partners. He handled the structure, the feedings, the pen expansions, the temperature control. Ginger handled the heart. She taught them through touch and patience. He taught them through environment and routine. Together, they built something between a home and a wilderness. As January deepened, the cubs grew fast. Their fur thickened, their eyes clear and bright. Scout became bold, scaling the enclosure walls. Poppy's frailty faded, replaced by quiet confidence. Rocky, though still cautious, began to test his vision, tracking snowflakes through the wire mesh. One evening, Harold found Ginger and the cubs outside under his supervision, playing in the snow. The cubs chased Ginger through the drifts, their paws kicking up powder, their playful growls echoing in the crisp air. When they tired, they flopped down beside her bellies to the sky, mirroring her exact posture. It looked, Harold thought, like joy. He leaned on the fence, feeling the ache in his knees, but also in his chest. A sweet ache, the kind that came from living again after too long frozen. As the sky turned rose and violet with the sunset, Ginger stood and stretched her fur, catching the light. The cubs followed suit, copying her every movement. Harold watched, silent and reverent. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family. By late February, the story of the cat who raised 3 orphaned bobcats had spread far beyond the snowy ridges of Harold Green's cabin. It began with a short video his granddaughter Lucy recorded on her old tablet, a clip meant just for family showing Ginger grooming Rocky, Scout, and Poppy as they tumbled around her like oversized kittens. The video captured something pure, almost unbelievable. Within a week, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Within 2 million were watching. Harold hadn't meant for any of it to go public. He'd lived his life quietly tucked away in the wilderness of Montana, tending to creatures that the world had forgotten. But the reserve's director saw an opportunity to raise awareness, to inspire, to bring hope. They installed a small live stream camera near the enclosure. "We'll turn it off if they show any stress," the director promised. Harold agreed reluctantly. The live stream went live on a cold Tuesday morning. At first, a few dozen viewers tuned in, then a few hundred, and then thousands. By the end of the week, the world was watching, teachers showing it to their classrooms, hospitals, playing it for patients, lonely souls tuning in from silent apartments in distant cities. The screen showed a cream-colored cat purring as 3 wild bobcats played around her, slept against her, followed her as though she were their mother. Harold didn't understand the fascination at first. To him, it was simply life unfolding, an act of quiet compassion between species. But to the rest of the world, it was something else entirely. It was proof that love could bridge anything. Letters began to arrive, thick stacks of envelopes carried through the storm by the local postman. Some were handwritten, others printed from emails by staff members at the reserve. A widow from Florida wrote, "Watching Ginger care for those cubs reminded me that I can still love after losing my husband." A young soldier from Texas confessed, "I came home broken, disconnected. But seeing your live stream reminded me that gentleness still exists." One letter from a child in Oregon simply said, "If a cat can love a bobcat, maybe people can love people again." Harold read every one of them. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he had to set them aside and walk away, the weight of them too much for his old heart to carry. The cubs, meanwhile, grew stronger each day. Their instincts sharpened. Their movements became quicker, more deliberate. Ginger continued her role with patient authority, teaching them without words. When they played too roughly, she would swat them gently. When they grew restless, she led them in slow, deliberate walks around the enclosure. Harold noticed something remarkable. Ginger was beginning to pull back, to let them lead, to let them fail and learn. He saw it for what it was, a mother's preparation for goodbye. And yet, even as their bond deepened outside, pressures grew. Conservation officials, environmental organizations, and wildlife specialists from across the country began contacting the reserve. Everyone wanted to weigh in. Some praised the experiment as a symbol of interspecies healing. Others condemned it, calling it interference with nature. A young reporter from Denver came to interview Harold, trudging through knee-deep snow to reach the cabin. Her name was Elise, and her questions were gentle but persistent. "Mr. Green," she asked, "do you think this story means something bigger than just animals? People are calling Ginger a symbol of compassion." Harold smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the enclosure where Ginger was sprawled in a patch of sunlight, her cubs beside her. "I think people see what they need to see," he said softly. "To me, she's just doing what love does, showing up when it's needed, no matter what shape it takes." The segment aired nationally that weekend. It ended with Harold's line, "Simple and steady love shows up." The phrase spread online like wildfire. Artists painted murals. Poets quoted it. News anchors repeated it. And all the while in the small snowbound cabin in Montana, Harold kept living his quiet routine, feeding, cleaning, watching. But as the world watched, the cubs began to change. Rocky's vision had almost fully returned. He spent hours perched on the highest platform, watching the forest beyond the glass. Scout became restless, testing the limits of the enclosure, pacing, yearning for space. Poppy, once fragile, now radiant with strength, had grown sleek and confident. They were no longer babies. Harold knew what that meant. The reserve had already begun discussions with the Green Bear Preserve in Colorado, acres of protected wilderness, perfect for young bobcats learning to survive on their own. It was the next step, the right step, but when he thought about it, his throat tightened. He had seen this moment too many times before the letting go, the quiet ache that followed. Only this time, it wasn't just the cubs he'd be saying goodbye to, it was Ginger's purpose. The night before the transport team was scheduled to arrive, Harold sat by the window watching the snow drift across the dark valley. Ginger was in the enclosure, surrounded by the three cubs. They were all lying together, their bodies forming a circle, just as they had the night they arrived. He realized then that she knew. Somehow she understood that her time with them was ending. Her eyes were open, calm, steady, not sad, not frightened, simply accepting. When the morning came, Harold opened the door and stood watching as the handlers prepared the transport crates. The cubs were wary but compliant, sensing the shift in energy. Poppy brushed against Ginger's side before stepping into her crate. Scout let out a low, confused growl. Rocky lingered, staring at Ginger with eyes that had once seen nothing and now saw everything. Then, in a gesture that stopped everyone cold, he padded over to Ginger and dropped something at her feet, a tiny field mouse he'd caught earlier that morning. His first hunt, his first gift. Harold's breath caught as Ginger bent her head and touched her nose to his. It was a farewell of perfect simplicity. The world would see this moment later captured on the reserve's camera and call it the most beautiful goodbye ever filmed. But to Harold, it was something quieter. It was the final act of a mother's love, the letting go that completes the circle. As the trucks drove away, Harold stood beside Ginger at the window, watching the trail of snow rise behind the departing convoy. The world outside the cabin had found hope in their story, but inside it was just two old souls side by side, watching the wilderness reclaim what it was owed. And for the first time, Harold didn't feel alone. The months that followed felt quieter than any winter Harold could remember. The enclosure, once alive with motion and sound, now stood empty. Its straw flattened the scent of the bobcats fading day by day. Ginger often wandered through it, sniffing corners, sitting in patches of sunlight where her cubs had once slept. She didn't call out. She didn't search. She simply watched, her green eyes patient, her posture peaceful, as if she understood that this emptiness was not loss, but fulfillment. Harold moved slower now, his joints stiff from years of cold mornings and long nights. Yet he found himself talking more to Ginger, to the empty enclosure, even to the mountain wind that swept across the reserve. He'd tell them about the letters still arriving, about the photos of the bobcats thriving in Colorado. The Green Bear Preserve sent updates every few weeks. Rocky, they said, had established a strong territory along the edge of a stream. Scout was more elusive, but trail cameras captured his lean, confident stride. And Poppy had given birth to two healthy cubs of her own. Harold smiled when he read that. She learned from the best, didn't she? Ginger, he'd whisper, scratching behind the cat's ear. Ginger would blink slowly, her tail flicking, the faint rumble of her purr filling the cabin. By early December, the snow returned to Silver Ridge, blanketing the world in white once again. Harold woke one morning to find the landscape transformed, the same quiet majesty that had greeted the night the cubs arrived. He brewed coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin, and sat by the window. Ginger was already there, her usual spot on the sill, warmed by the weak winter sun. She was older now. Her fur, once cream, had silvered slightly around her muzzle. But her eyes remained bright and clear, fixed on the distant hills. It was then he saw them, three shapes moving through the snow at the edge of the tree line, graceful, deliberate, unmistakable. Harold froze, the mug trembling in his hands. They stood there side by side, watching the cabin, too far for detail but close enough that his heart knew before his mind caught up. Rocky, Scout, Poppy, Ginger, he breathed. They came back. The old cat stood, tail high, ears forward. She pressed her front paws against the glass eyes locked on the figures beyond. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Then one of the bobcats, Rocky, perhaps lowered his head, a slow, deliberate bow. The others followed. Harold felt tears spill down his cheeks. "They remember," he whispered. "After all this time, they remember." Ginger didn't make a sound. She didn't meow or scratch. She simply stood there, her small body still as stone, her gaze unwavering. The snow swirled between them, silent and infinite, connecting cabin and wild past and present love and freedom. The bobcats lingered for a few minutes more before turning back toward the forest, their spotted coats vanishing into the white. Ginger watched until they were gone, then stepped down and curled into her bed by the fire. Harold sat beside her, his wrinkled hand resting on her back. "You did it, old girl," he murmured. "You gave them the wild, and they gave you forever." Outside, snow fell heavier, blanketing the tracks that led into the trees. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying a sound that might have been the faint echo of a purr. Years would pass, and people would still tell the story of Ginger, the house cat who raised 3 wild bobcats. Some would call it a miracle, others a mystery. But to those who understood, it was something simpler. It was proof that love leaves tracks no snow can ever cover. In the end, the story of Harold and Ginger wasn't just about animals. It was about healing compassion and the quiet power of love that knows no boundaries. A man who thought his days of purpose were behind him, a cat who had lost everything, and 3 wild creatures born into trauma somehow found each other in the heart of a Montana winter. Together, they proved that survival isn't only about strength or instinct, it's about connection. It's about the courage to reach out when the world feels cold and to keep loving even after loss. Through Ginger's gentle heart and Harold's steadfast care, we are reminded that kindness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it purrs softly in the silence of grief, whispering that hope can be reborn in the most unexpected places. The bond between a domestic cat and wild bobcats shouldn't have existed. Nature doesn't script such things. But love, real unconditional love, often rewrites the rules. It shows us that even the smallest act of empathy can ripple outward, changing not just one life but many. When the world watched Ginger nurture those cubs, something stirred deep within millions of hearts. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. We saw our own pain mirrored in those orphaned creatures. We saw our own healing in Ginger's patient care. And we understood, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that to love deeply is to bridge distances that logic cannot. The bobcats grew wild and free as they were meant to, but they carried with them something eternal, the memory of being loved when they needed it most. Just as Harold carried the memory of Margaret and Ginger carried the ache of her lost kittens, love became their common language. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: compassion is never wasted. No matter how small, it leaves a mark that endures. It teaches us that broken hearts can mend, that wild things can trust again, and that even in the coldest winters, warmth can find its way back home. And if this story touched your heart even a little, don't forget to support this channel, like, share, and subscribe, so we can continue to bring you more stories that remind us of what truly matters: love, courage, and the quiet miracles that bind us all.